This changed my treatment approach forever. Understanding tensegrity gave me a completely different view of anatomy, biomechanics, and how the body really works. I hope you enjoyed your Australia Day long weekend. For my friends in the US, that's our equivalent of the 4th of July. We got to share some family beach time in a beautiful coastal spot about 3 hours north of Sydney, and we were joined by 3 other families, so there were 8 adults and 7 kids in total. We're really blessed with the community that we have at my boys' school. I guess it really says something when you choose to spend your school holidays hanging out with the same people that you see every day in the school term. In last week's episode of the Footbrain Connection, we looked at arches and how they act as a distribution system for compressive forces. Today we're going to look at another strain distribution system, how the body deals with tensile forces. As Tom Myers, author of Anatomytrains, puts it, tension and compression are the yin and yang of biomechanics. So today we're exploring the concept of tensegrity and the vital role it plays in our body mechanics, our movement, and our overall health. Tensegrity is a structural principle where isolated compression elements are held in place by a continuous network of tension elements, creating stability through balanced forces. The term was first coined by Buckminster Fuller in 1955, originally to describe man-made structures. Since then, it's also been recognized as a key organizing principle in the body. Despite the concept having been around for decades, it was never part of my university education. I was taught to conceptualize the body as a continuous compression structure, with each element stacked on top of the one below it, kind of like a house made of bricks where each brick rests on the brick below it. In this view, the weight of the head sits on C7, the weight of the torso rests on L5, and the whole thing rests on the feet, legs, and pelvis. Our bones are our load-bearing elements, held together by our ligaments, and our muscles are the levers that move the bones and joints. The role of fascia was never emphasized. That was just the stuff that you dissected away to get to the important bits. This is a view that has radically changed in the last 20 years, as we've understood more about fascia and its vital role in the body. In my ongoing search to elucidate the mechanisms behind betterbalanceorthotics, how they create the results that we all see in our clinics on a daily basis, this has led me to a deeply fascinating study of the fascial system. Dr. Ed Butterworth, the original inventor of betterbalanceorthotics, although they weren't called that at the time, believed that their primary mechanism of action in the body was through the fascia. In this, and in many other ways, he was ahead of his time. As a chiropractor, my first lens for understanding our orthotics impact is through the nervous system. After all, chiropractors are nervous system doctors, despite our frustratingly persistent reputation as backcrackers. Hence the name of this show, the Footbrain Connection. However, I've also come to understand that Dr. Ed was correct. The orthotics do have a huge influence on the whole body through our fascial system, and it's our fascial system that makes the human body a tensegrity-based system. So let's talk about the role of fascia in the body. Our fascial web develops when we're only 15 days in utero, and it stays with us throughout our entire lives. It completely envelops our muscles, bones, and organs, running from the top of our head to the tips of our toes. It's made of one continuous sheet. If you were to remove all our muscles, bones, and tissues, you could unravel it out into one single sheet. This is part of what gives it its unique properties. It forms the scaffolding of our nerves, arteries, and veins, and it's been said that the brain listens to fascia and talks to muscles. This is because the fascia contains about 250 million nerve endings. That's 6 to 10 times more than muscle tissue. While muscles contain nerves for contraction and proprioception, fascia is packed with sensory receptors, including nociceptors and mechanoreceptors that detect pain, tension, and movement. It also contains thermoreceptors, chemoreceptors, and automatic nerve endings involved in emotional regulation. For this reason, it's considered one of the body's largest sensory organs. Fascia also contains sympathetic efferent nerves, which may explain the mechanism behind why stress often manifests in the body as areas of stiffness and tightness, particularly around the neck and shoulders. Fascia doesn't just wrap around our muscles, it's completely enmeshed with them. It surrounds every individual muscle fiber, bundle, and the entire muscle, often acting as the interface between the body and the nervous system. Jack Thompson, creator of the course Fascia Strength and Power uses the metaphor of wearing a fascial wetsuit that stretches over the entire body. He teaches that we can develop a level of fascial strength, elasticity, and control that makes our movements much more fluid, efficient, and powerful. These concepts have been explored for centuries through the martial arts, and although I haven't found supporting research for his ideas yet, I can attest from my own personal experience that he does seem to be onto something. Jack teaches a series of movements and exercises designed to remove the slack from our fascial wetsuit and generate power from the elastic properties of our fascia, rather than purely through muscular effort. For a potent example of this concept, check out videos of Bruce Lee performing his famous 1-inch punch. He drives a stunning amount of force through his back foot all the way out through his fist, which is a fascinating demonstration of how force is transferred through our fascial lines. It's also a great example of this fascia strength concept. There's no way muscle alone could generate this amount of force with such a small movement. It's the potential energy stored in the fascia that multiplies the kinetic energy of the punch. If you raise your arm above your head right now and just notice how it feels, we could assign that a rating of 100% muscular power. From my own subjective experience of his techniques, it's possible to do the same movement in such a way that it feels like it's only 50 to 60% muscular power. Kind of almost feels like the arm's just raising itself. Which sounds bizarre, I know, but that's genuinely how it feels when you follow his program. He also teaches a concept that he calls moving from center, where you initiate movement, for example an arm movement, right from your core instead of your shoulder muscles. Applying these concepts has helped immensely with my adjusting. As chiropractors, if we had good teachers, we're kind of trained to do this anyway, and I think truly great adjusters do it instinctively. But I've found that when I really consciously increase my focus on it, the results are highly significant. I also noticed that my posture and movement efficiency improve, leading to noticeably less fatigue at the end of a full day of adjusting. According to Jack, one of the greatest sources of fascial power in the body comes from our feet. He claims that most people have weak, dysfunctional feet. Sound familiar? Sound like anyone you know? And this is the only thing anchoring us to the ground. And so it's impossible to remove the slack from our fascial wetsuit unless we develop what he calls springboard feet. This concept of removing slack from the system is essential to how tensegrity structures operate. So how does tensegrity apply in clinical practice? Well, in a tensegrity-based structure, the load-bearing compressive elements are not stacked on top of each other. In fact, they're not even touching. They're held in place by a balanced web of tension. As Tom Myers describes it when it comes to the body, our bones are floating in a sea of soft tissue that maintains their integrity. When you introduce slack into this kind of system, you undermine the integrity of the whole structure. In clinic, I use this model to explain the concept to my patients. It's a tensegrity-based model of the human pelvis. None of the wooden struts, which represent the bones, for instance, this one in the middle is the sacrum, are touching each other. Instead, their position, relationships, and relative movements are maintained by the web of tensile elements in between them, representing our ligaments and fascia. Now, to be clear, this model isn't meant to be anatomically accurate. Rather, it's a model of the forces at play in moving the pelvis. You can see how as I walk the legs, everything moves around the relatively stable central stick, which is, like I said, the sacrum. There are several interesting points we can demonstrate with this model. One thing to note is that there's a large degree of flexibility and mobility in the system, yet the individual wires between the struts are actually quite inelastic. The elastic properties of the model emerge from the entirety of the system rather than from the individual elements that comprise it. This is also true of our fascia, which has a high degree of mobility and elasticity, even though the actual collagen that it's made of is quite inelastic. Another interesting property is that when I pull on any one wire, that change in tension can be felt throughout every other wire in the model. This is also true for the fascial system in our body, and it has major clinical implications. This is one reason why an old ankle or knee injury often sets us up for a future injury in the spine or the opposite shoulder down the track. As we move through life, accumulating macro and micro injuries along the way, we're introducing more and more areas of slack and the resulting inappropriate tension into our fascial web. And this leaves us more and more vulnerable and less resilient over time. Unless, of course, we do something to correct the slack in the system. Regular chiropractic care is a great place to start, but unfortunately it's not always enough on its own. When we look at the myofascial tracts described by Thomas Myers in his book Anatomytrains, we can see that all of them except for the arm lines begin on the feet. This makes sense. Really what those tracts describe are the pathways that force takes as it moves throughout our body. And all force ultimately has to be anchored back into the ground. Otherwise we fall over. This makes our feet a particularly potent place for clinical intervention. I'm sure you've experienced this, right? Have you ever had a foot massage and felt tension melting from your neck and your shoulders, or in fact throughout your whole body? This is an example of removing the slack in one part of the fascial web and simultaneously feeling the effects throughout the entire structure. Notice that I said removing the slack, not removing the tension. This is a critical distinction. In a tensegrity structure, excessive tension is created when there is slack in the tensile elements that keep everything balanced. This allows force to focus and concentrate in specific locations, rather than being evenly distributed throughout the whole system. This is why Jack Thompson tells us that we need to remove the slack from our fascial wetsuit and create springboard feet. It's a highly counterintuitive way of thinking, but it can be extremely clinically useful. So let's look at the clinical implications of removing slack or weakness rather than focusing on tightness. This was one of the brilliant fundamental insights of Dr. George Goodhart, the founder of applied kinesiology. In fact, it's one of the things that first got me interested in applied kinesiology over 25 years ago. Rather than trying to fix tight muscles, which is what everyone else was doing by rubbing, stretching, all these different techniques, Dr. Goodhart focused on fixing the weak antagonist muscle that was actually responsible for the tight muscle in the first place. Now that's tensegrity-based thinking. Even at that early stage of my career, when I was in the student clinic, I observed the effectiveness of this approach. I noticed that when I focused on releasing tightness, my patients often got temporary relief, but the tightness often returned, and sometimes really frustratingly quickly. Whereas if I fixed the weak muscle, which was the real cause of the issue, the patient often experienced lasting results. Learning this was an aha moment for me, one of those pivotal moments that changes everything from that moment forward. Understanding the principles of tensegrity and slack was another one of those moments. It's the same basic fix the weakness to balance out the tightness idea, except this time the weakness is a dysfunctional ligament or fascial element rather than just a muscle. So how can we apply this? Well, traditional thinking says that once a ligament or fascia is overstretched or damaged, there's no going back. This is one of the primary arguments I've seen for the use of traditional orthotics and supportive shoes. But I simply haven't found it to be true in clinical practice. There is way more to the body's adaptive healing capacity than many give it credit for. One of the most effective tools I've found is Dr. Joe Schaefer's ligament implant technique. When a ligament or a joint capsule is dysfunctional, it gives that joint a real sloppy, spongy end feel. It's very distinctive. Patients can feel it too, especially if you take the time to point it out to them. As soon as you apply the correction, immediately it changes. The end feel of that joint normalizes. And again, the patient can clearly feel it. However, that's not all that happens. Tension throughout the whole body shifts and dissipates, sometimes in quite distant locations. This is tensegrity in action. Even if you're not familiar with this particular clinical technique, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, one of the fastest, most efficient ways to activate this effect throughout the whole body is simply by standing and walking on betterbalanceorthotics daily. By stimulating the muscles, nerves, and fascia in the feet, you don't just wake up the brain and improve the foot mechanics. You influence the entire fascial web, which changes everything. Last week, I had one of our new docs, Dr. Caleb Carlson, share with me that within a week of wearing Better Balance Orthotics, he saw a consistent 20-point improvement in his sleep as measured through his watch. He also saw significant improvement in his blind spot mapping. His blind spots became symmetrical, where previously they'd been consistently larger on the right, which is an indication of imbalance between the two brain hemispheres. Not only that, when he wore his old traditional orthotics in his work boots for a day, his sleep immediately dropped by 20 points and went right back up again when he switched back to Better Balance Orthotics. These are significant neurological changes that on the surface we might think has nothing to do with feet. Yet that was his experience. I hear about these kind of experiences every day, both from patients and from docs around the world. We're only just scratching the surface when we start to understand the mechanisms at play here. There's so much more we could dig into. But I realize this has kind of been a long video, so I'll save it for another day. If you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with me. Suffice to say that anything you do to improve your patients or your own fascial dynamics is having a profoundly beneficial effect on probably way more levels than we currently realize. Till next week, have a great week. And by the way, I'd love to know what you think of the format of these videos. Was there anything that particularly resonated or was valuable for you in today's episode? Please just comment below and let me know. Thanks.